Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at @TheImprintNews. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at safecampaudio on social media. So I hope everyone had a great end to 2023 and a terrific beginning of 2024. This is the first episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast for 2024. I was out of the country for quite a bit of this. I was fortunate enough to spend the holidays, both Christmas and New Year's, in Tanzania with my mom, my wife, and my in-laws. Got to see the village where my mom has set up over the years a really impactful and successful program that educates young learners and empowers young women in Tanzania. Got to do the safari thing. Got to spend some time in Zanzibar, had a celebrity sighting in Zanzibar. I was getting out of a pool and dried off. Then I was headed back to my room and I turned and almost ran smack dab into Yassine Bey, better known to most as the Mos Def, who's certainly one of my favorite rappers of all time. Sort of almost bumped into him, took a step back, realized who it was, and all I could say was, whoa. And he was very nice about it. He laughed and we talked for a minute. So that was very cool. So I'm going to experiment a bit with the sort of the layout and mapping of the podcast this year, which, by the way, is our fourth full year of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. That is insane to me. And sort of the impetus behind this is that, when I started this podcast, I was sort of only the senior editor of the Imprint. Now I'm a co-executive director of Fostering Media Connections, which is the parent organization over that, the Imprint, Fostering Families Today, our Youth Voices Rising program, and all that. In full candor, if I knew that I was going to be doing that job when we started the podcast, I would not have set a weekly pace for the show. And it has been somewhat challenging to fill up each week as we originally intended it, which was to be, pairing both news and an analysis of the headlines with a guest interview every week. We're still going to do those things. What I'm thinking will probably happen is that we will devote several episodes each month fully to guest interviews. And I'll obviously introduce it like I am right now, talk a little bit about the guest and what we're going to talk about. Maybe if there's a particular headline, especially from one of our Imprint reporters from that week, I'll call that out at the beginning. But really, we'll just get right into the interviews. And then we'll have sort of a monthly headlines edition of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, which will solely be devoted to kind of going over the news of the month, what we've written, what other outlets have been working on, and kind of handle it like that. And then I'll also, as we kind of work into more podcast spaces, both with the Imprint Weekly Podcast, but with Safe Camp Audio, our podcast network, use our sort of Imprint Weekly feed to feature, more shows and more programs and things that we're working on. So that is all to say, don't be surprised if it kind of comes across a little bit different than it has been. And we'll be playing around with this, and maybe at the end I'll just come to the conclusion it was probably the best the way it was. But all this is to make sure that we're still delivering a really quality program in each week, no matter whether that's a guest interview or kind of a review of the headlines or whatever. So on this episode, you are going to hear my conversation with Shelley Jackson, who is the law enforcement policies attorney for an organization called Strategies for Youth, which I think is the only national organization that's really focused on working on that true front end of juvenile justice, which is the interaction between kids and cops. Shelley and I talked about the 12 model law enforcement policies for youth, which is something that the organization put together and released late last year. It provides guidance around all kinds of different factors around policing of young people, school settings, use of force, race and orientation, and much more than that. Writing such guidance is well within the expertise of Ms. Jackson, who kind of ran point on this, along with Lisa Thoreau, who is the founder of Strategies for Youth. She's been on this podcast before. Jackson spent 30 years writing civil rights guidance for the Departments of Education, Justice, and Health and Human Services. And I talked to her a little bit about that part of her career and kind of what stood out and whether she had gotten into this issue of juvenile justice in her career before. So let's get to it. Here is our conversation with Shelley Jackson of Strategies for Youth. All right, we are joined today by Shelley Jackson of Strategies for Youth to talk about her organization's newly released 12 model law enforcement policies for youth. Shelley is the right person to talk about that because her title is Law Enforcement Policies Attorney for Strategies for Youth. So Shelley, thanks for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to talk about this project.
So let's get these guys to know you a little bit. House rules here on the podcast. You got to give me at least one of your favorites. The categories are movie or TV show, musical group, sports team, or book. You can give me one. You can give me more than one, but you got to give me one. Shelley, what do you got?
Okay. My favorite movie is Casablanca, and probably the favorite recent book that I've read is How the Word is Passed.
All right. Good choices both. So before I want to talk about you for just a sec before we get into this guide, because you spent 30 years, am I correct, working on civil rights guidance on the federal level before you joined Strategies for Youth?
More or less, not quite 30, but I did spend 30 years as a civil rights attorney. First, I worked for a couple of nonprofits, and then I went into federal service in 1996. And so I worked for the Department of Justice. That was sort of the bookends of my federal career. But I also worked in the civil rights offices of the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Education. And all three of those agencies, to a varying degree, dealt with policies. At Education and HHS, often the Civil Rights Office, in addition to doing investigations, would put out policies through what were called Dear Colleague letters, advising hospitals, public agencies, schools about certain civil rights issues, how the department saw them, guidance about how to implement the law. And then at DOJ, primarily this happened when we would do an investigation, settle an investigation. The section that I worked in dealt with a number of different public agencies, law enforcement, juvenile and adult corrections, disability or agencies. And so often when you do an investigation and try to resolve that investigation, a lot of it was this Department of Corrections or this police department or whatever needed to change their policies. And so as part of the implementation of an agreement, lawyers in the department would be involved in reviewing and sometimes signing off on agency policies.
So at any given time, a civil rights office within one of the big, executive branch agencies is crafting actual regulatory policy, investigating people that may have run afoul, not people, usually entities that run afoul of civil rights. And then the third bucket, which I think is you described, if I understand, like a Dear Colleague letter is sort of something that probably goes out to a lot of different agencies around the country and says, we're just reminding you, given recent things, that this is what you need to be doing, right? That's probably the substance.
Correct. Yeah. The Dear Colleague letters were not solely, but largely prospective. Here's an issue that's arisen. We want to advise you or remind you about your civil rights obligations. And then the implementation of the investigations is remedial or responsive in a particular situation.
Yeah. Do you recall in all those years, not quite 30, but a lot of years working with this stuff, where the issue we're about to talk about specifically came up? I mean, the policing of youth did that ever cross your radar as a federal employee?
Yes. And when I was in the Department of Justice, and here's where I need to insert the disclaimer that as a former attorney, I can't speak for the department anymore, but When I was in the Department of Justice, I worked on a couple of matters involving interactions between police officers and youth. I worked on a lawsuit in Meridian, Mississippi, which was in Lauderdale County. And one of the issues there was about law enforcement responses to requests from the local school district to interact with youth for often minor school-related misbehaviors. So what we did an investigation there, we reached a settlement with the Meridian Police Department, and then to implement that settlement, which concluded successfully, we did things like talk about training, talk about what are the circumstances under which law enforcement officers respond, talk about what are rules around engaging with young people in terms of interrogation and the overlap, or where there really should not be an overlap, between the law enforcement response and a routine school disciplinary matter. So that was one matter that I worked on. And then I worked on what DOJ calls a statement of interest, which is like an amicus brief, but it's called something special when DOJ does it at a federal district court level. And this was a matter that was in Kenton County, Kentucky, about two young children with disabilities and the interaction that they had with a sheriff's deputy who was assigned to the school as a school resource officer. So those were a couple of the matters that I was personally involved in.
I've always wondered like how political that process in that office is. I mean, you just described two very meaningful and important things that, that were right for the department to run down. Like, does this stuff, when one administration changes to the next, I think my assumption from the outside, a lot of people would think like, oh, that's an office that would kind of be a weather vane and kind of change directions with the proclivities of an administration. But is that the case, or is it a pretty consistent and steady shop when it comes to the things you've described?
Well, I mean, every administration has its own priorities and what they're interested in and what they really want you to focus in on. But I think one thing that promotes continuity is, for better or for worse, the cases that my former section handles go on for a long time. There's an investigation. The investigation takes a long time. The investigative findings need to be approved all the way up the chain. And then if there's a lawsuit, you're, pursuing that vigorously. And then there's a settlement. So I think that, for better or for worse, the bureaucracy has its own tide that carries on and that promotes continuity.
Oh, that's a beautiful phrase there. Bureaucracy has its own tide. That's so true. Okay, so let's get into what you guys have been up to. But I think we've gone like probably 5 minutes in, and I didn't really explain what Strategies for Youth is. Now, we had Strategies for Youth, founder Lisa Thoreau on here back in 2021. I'll drop a link to folks in our show notes to that interview for anyone who wants to go deeper on other things that Strategies for Youth works on. But Shelley, maybe you could just kind of sum up quickly for folks the mission of the organization, what you guys do overall.
Sure. So Strategies for Youth is a national nonprofit. It's based in Massachusetts, and it's a policy and training organization. And the mission basically is to ensure that when youth interact with law enforcement, that there's the best possible outcome from those interactions. We believe that arrest and formal involvement in the legal system is the least desirable outcome for youth, and that should be considered only as a last resort. And we also believe that law enforcement officers should be equipped with training and policies, the subject of our conversation today, to work with youth in a way that's developmentally appropriate, trauma-informed, and equitable. And so the organization has typically done this in a number of different ways. A lot of training of individual departments, individual police departments, training for youth about, they often have misperceptions about their obligations and their rights and what happens in those interactions. So trying to train youth about that, and Then the policy project that I have been working on for about a year is a way to sort of make that writ large rather than going department by department, to try to put out a compendium of policies that law enforcement agencies can adopt so that they are informed and prepared when dealing with youth. Because what we have found is that most are not.
Right. And so, yeah, just to accentuate two things that Shelley mentioned there, I really think Strategy Street is probably the only organization in this country that really goes in and does that kind of youth specific training with police departments. And then on the engaging with youth side, it's worth checking out if you're interested in this subject, the Juvenile Justice Jeopardy, which they have put together. That's a really fun kind of gamified way to engage young people on it. So that's really cool. Well, let's start with a big metaphysical question on what you've been working on, which is this sort of 12 model policies, because I don't think everybody would come into this conversation sold on this. Why do we need police to have a specific set of policies around interacting with youth as opposed to how they would carry themselves in every interaction? Why a specific youth policy?
Great question. Basically, because youth are different. To paraphrase or maybe even directly quote the US Supreme Court, they're not just small adults. They are at a developmentally different stage at 12 or 14 or 16 than somebody is at 30 or 40. A youth may see an officer differently, may react differently, just things that, anybody who's ever known a kid knows. They're impulsive. They take risks when perhaps they shouldn't. They don't have the capacity that we wish that they had for self-regulation. They care a lot about what their peers want, and they don't plan ahead as often as they should. And all of those totally, developmentally appropriate conditions put them at risk when the law enforcement officer shows up and starts interacting with them. And so what we have been trying to do through these policies is to give officers the tools to understand that and to interact with kids so that things don't spiral out of control. We try to monitor media about law enforcement interaction with kids. And, pretty much on a weekly basis, there's some very disturbing situation. Law enforcement officer takes a kid to the ground. Law enforcement officer uses a lot of force with a young kid or a kid that's not really posing a threat, or the youth has a disability, but the officer doesn't understand that it's the disability that's keeping the youth from following their commands. On a very regular basis, these problems occur, and we wanted to try to help officers deal with that and to protect kids.
I noticed that tracker that you guys have on the website. That's really helpful. It looks like, just from the visible part that you started that this year. And the Strategies for Youth website kind of mentions a rising number of reports of harmful interactions. Is there that surprised me? Is there really a rise numerically, or do you feel like this is becoming more visible now? I guess I was surprised to see it described as rising only because while these issues are very real, the sheer number of youth being arrested has gone down and down and down for decades. So you know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I do know what you mean. I think maybe rising in that coming to the attention, being reported. I said we probably see something on a weekly basis, and those are just the incidents that get to the attention of the media that get picked up by the Strategies for Youth team in monitoring these things.
And all the more reason why a police department, I would think, would want to have some sort of way to approach and engage our officers on what to do, because it just takes, we're just in a different world than we were even 10 years ago, like
Correct.
Something goes onto Instagram, you can't control it after that. That's going out. You're going to see millions of people are going to see that.
Correct. That's correct. So many things are, coming to the attention of the public that were not before. One of the things that Lisa and I wrote an opinion piece in Washington Monthly a couple of months ago in August. We wanted to highlight for the public the fact that the Department of Justice investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department got a lot of attention for many good reasons. But one thing that report talked about, and disclaimer, I was not involved in any way. One thing that the report talked about was excessive force directed against youth. And one thing that came out in the report is 3 years before Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, he interacted with a 14-year-old boy where he knelt on the boy's neck or shoulders, and that happened 3 years before Mr. Floyd was killed. So, we felt like the need is out there, and it's true that the numbers have gone down, but unfortunately, some of the things that haven't gone down are racial disproportionality.
No, in fact, on some level, those have gone up, especially
Yes.
when you go deeper into the system.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And unfortunately for some kids, particularly kids of color, that first interaction leading to arrest then often leads to deeper involvement in the system. And once you get into juvenile corrections, then you see, a big disparity in terms of race.
Are you a professional in the field of child welfare, juvenile justice, or other family and youth services? Subscribe today to Youth Services Insider, the imprint's exclusive section on all the insider news you need to stay in the know. Funding opportunities, major federal and state policy shifts, interviews with key leaders in the field. It's all available only for our Youth Services Insider subscribers. Sign up for a monthly or yearly subscription today by visiting imprintnews.org/subscribe. Our podcast listeners get 10% off their subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10. That's imprintnews.org/subscribe and get 10% off your subscription by entering the promo code PODCAST10 today.
So you guys felt the need to put this together. How did Strategies for Youth build this set of recommended policies? I mean, who worked with you on it? What was the process? I'm sure there were some furtive conversations, right, about what exactly should go in. So how'd you all do it?
Sure. So the primary drafters of the policy were Lisa Thoreau, the executive director, and myself. And we had an idea about different topics that we wanted to cover. So, and here's where I'll put in a plug. The policies are at strategiesforyouth.org. And if you look at the policies, what you see is there are a number of policies that are about different stages in the potential interaction between law enforcement and youth. So an investigatory stop, a stop on the street, arrest, youth interrogation, use of force. But then we have some other policies that deal with certain subsets of youth of color, immigrants, LGBTQ, youth with disabilities. And then we have other policies that deal with particular situations. So for example, law enforcement interactions with youth when they're at the youth home to arrest a parent or another adult in the family, a youth who's a victim of sex trafficking, youth in schools is a big issue, obviously. So Lisa and I thought about, well, what big buckets do we want to cover? We drafted the policies and then they were sent out to a wide number of reviewers, I think about 50, if I'm not mistaken. And on our website, there's a link where people can see who the reviewers were. But some of these reviewers were defense counsel, some were prosecutors. A lot of our work is based on what we know about youth development. And so there were a lot of psychologists, academics, people who had done research and could verify, and in fact, often were the sources that we cite in the appendix for 10 of the 12 policies. So we had a wide array. We had some law enforcement officers, current and past, also review the policies because we really wanted to get, a wide view of does this make sense? Is this unrealistic? What's your view, on the positions that we're taking here? So we had reviewers who did that. And then in terms of the research for the policies, as some of it came out of Strategies for Youth and their long working relationship through the training and other work that they have done. We did legal research, we did social science research. We looked at agencies that had developed policies that we thought were promising because we figured if a law enforcement agency may be most persuaded by the fact that somebody else has done it. So whenever we could find what we thought was a good policy that was consistent with the guidance and the principles, we cited that. We, tried to make sure that if somebody wanted to know who has a good policy about youth interrogation, or is it really true what I said to you that youth aren't really little adults and that their brains really are developing different, and that explains a lot about the way that they act. Where could I find out more? So we drafted the initial policies, we circulated them to our reviewers, we got back from the reviewers their views, made a lot of changes, so structurally and substantively, and then we released them on November 1st.
Great summary of that. Okay, so you got it, worked it up internally based on research and all kinds of work, and then proliferated it out to this wide group for feedback and incorporated the feedback. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah, I want to delve back into, you did a good job kind of highlighting all the different things that are in here, but I kind of, in my own mind, grouped them into a few segments, and I'm hoping you can, just give folks that are listening the sort of essence of what is recommended in each one of these groups. And if you disagree with me on how I've grouped it, feel free to say that too. So we'll go by policy 1, which I think is a very good sort of overarching statement of principles for the whole thing. But I would say, policies 2 through 4 are about engaging with youth on the street, as it were, like searching them, confronting them, arresting them, taking them into custody or not taking them into custody. It's all about that stuff before you'd ever put a kid in a car or anything like that.
Right, or get the youth to a station if you're going to arrest them and interrogate them.
Sure. So in that box, what are the things that you would tell somebody listening now are like the biggest, the overarching essence of what the policies drive at here?
Wow, what a great question. I think some of it is being driven from the idea that a youth is different, and so. For example, I think we deal with this in the investigatory stops. Officer approaches a youth on the street, youth runs away. What does that mean? It does not necessarily mean, the research shows us, that the youth is guilty. The youth could be running because they're afraid. So we're trying to guide officers about how to see those interactions, those routine law enforcement interactions, from the youth's point of view, and not to overreact, when to try to de-escalate the interaction. So I think that's probably a big part of policy 2, where we talk about the stops and the non-custodial interviews, because these are youth who aren't in custody. The officer is doing some sort of investigation in the interaction. I think some of what we talk about in policy 3, which is about arrest, transport, booking, and temporary custody, things about if you're going to bring a youth into custody, how to make sure that the youth is safe. So try to avoid transporting the youth with an adult. When you might want to try to avoid handcuffs, those kinds of things. In policy 4, which deals with Miranda, youth waivers and youth interrogations, again, a lot about how a youth views that situation, because what we have found through the research is that youth confess falsely a lot, and false confessions lead to, often false convictions, or they may lead to evidence being tossed out. So we talk a lot about how the youth sees that interaction, the importance in those interactions for the youth to have legal counsel present. And one of the things that dovetails with our policy there is, in preparation for putting out the policy, something I forgot to say earlier, in September, Strategies for Youth had a poll conducted about what people generally thought, what Americans thought about law enforcement and youth. And we were pleased to see that there was quite a strong interest. I think it was 80% of the respondents who thought, yes, officers definitely need to Mirandize youth, make special efforts to make sure that youth understood Miranda, and that youth should have lawyers with them during those interrogations. So we talk a lot about those issues in Policy 4.
Yeah, and I think there was this long run of Supreme Court decisions around what you could do in terms of very long sentences for youth who are brought into the adult system, right? Like
That's
starting with
correct.
Roper, ban the death penalty, all the way to now you really just can only use life without parole for homicides, and then it can't be automatic. And then there was this other decision that was very significant in juvenile justice, but I just don't think ever really got the same attention, which is that JDB case in North Carolina. And I think this is kind of the first, I know it isn't, but to me, it was like, oh, I hadn't really seen anybody kind of put policy to paper around, urging police to take what JDB says into account. Which is, I'm going to fumble it. You probably have it a little bit better in the front of your mind. But basically, if there's any chance a youth wouldn't feel comfortable leaving a situation with police, you got to arrest them. You have to read them their rights and then give them the opportunity for an attorney, right? I mean, that's probably oversimplifying it, but
a little bit, yeah. But you have the essence of it. And basically what JDB, what the holding was, is that the officer has to take into account the youth's age, because Miranda attaches when the person's in custody. When is the person in custody? When they don't feel they're free to terminate the interaction and leave. And so if an officer knows or, can reasonably discern the age of the youth, they have to take that into account when they're deciding, is this person in custody? And therefore, do I need to Mirandize them?
Yeah.
And in the appendix to that policy, we talk about a number of court decisions that sort of go through some of that analysis. When the Supreme Court sets the general tone very high, and then it's left to lower courts in individual cases to interpret that. And so we went through a number of cases that really analyze, when would this kid have felt free to terminate this interview? And if not, why? And all sorts of little factual scenarios that really brought that into play.
Yeah. So next box I had all by itself, because I just think it's probably that unique and important from the other ones, is use of force, right? That's policy 5, yes. Use of force. What would you say is the most substantive difference in the way a police officer should be thinking about the need to use force with a youth versus an adult?
Great question. Well, the use of force analysis from a legal standpoint is, in the totality of the circumstances, what risk does this person pose to themselves, to the officer? And the policies, well, they do a number of things. The policy 5, it urges officers not to forget that this is a kid we're talking about, right? This could be a skinny 11-year-old, the kid that's unarmed. You should not do your use of force analysis in the same way with that kid as you would, a 200-pound 40-year-old. It just, the level of risk is generally going to be different. And so we try to guide officers through that analysis. And we also, in that policy, try to talk about the particular risks to youth from some specific types of uses of force. So tasers and conducted electrical weapons and information about how youth are particularly harmed, I think, because of their youth, their age, their development, from some uses of force. And then, of course, trying to urge officers, once again, even though the policy recognizes that often when an officer is using force, it's a split second decision, something that's happening in the moment. But, revert back to your training and what you're taught about youth, which is something that we hope will happen, and just bring that into account in those interactions.
Yeah. And I think when you hear somebody talking about use of force, I think it's somewhat reasonable to leap to the most high stakes concept of somebody is running at a police officer. Maybe they have a weapon, even if they're a teenager, right? So that's
Right.
a very serious thing. But there is, and I think you guys do well to kind of call this out as like a serious, issue within this concept of policing youth. Kids are very good at pissing adults off. They just are. I was when I was a kid. I get my dad on the podcast to attest to that. But I mean, use of force is not just in those very high stakes moments. I think you guys do well. And I know Lisa spoke about this a lot, including on our podcast, about just, they say a lot of things. They do a lot of things that could make you want to put your hands on them. And it's like, I think that to me, that's like a good argument in favor of, having a specific policy that informs not how people carry it out on the street as much as how you as a police department or a law enforcement agency train people to be out there, right? Like that's what it really comes down to. It's not like, well, how are police going to remember these 50 policies every day? And it's like, that's not the point, right? This is for them. This is a statement of principles on which they should be trained early in their career.
Correct. Just inculcating, all right, what does my training tell me about this interaction? Which, we presume or hope that police officers and a lot of other professionals have training to guide them in the moment. Yes. I mean, just a couple of things about force. Yes, you're right. There's a stereotypical worst case scenario. But in fact, according to the Department of Justice, in 2020, I think there was only like 8% of youth infractions involved most of, violent behavior. So most youth are not involved in high-level violent interactions. And just thinking back to the matter I was discussing with you, where I was involved at DOJ in Kenton County, Kentucky, I believe there were two young children. The boy, I think he was 8, and he might have weighed 50 pounds. The officer was a full-grown man. So, the record, as I recall, is that the boy was saying some not very pleasant things to the officer and he was swinging, but he's a 50-pound 8-year-old. How much damage is he really going to do to a grown man? So those are often the kinds of situations where officers get involved and where force can be used. And we're just in that policy trying to bring them back to their youth. You have to take that into account in the totality of the circumstances. You have to try to slow down and de-escalate the interaction so that everybody can take a breath and go home.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
So policies 6 through 10, I would kind of put in the group of, interacting with specific subsets of youth.
Yes,
that's youth of color, youth with disabilities, mental health breaks or are on drugs, and then students, people in school. So that's kind of that is a neat box to put them all in, but those are very different things when you break it down. I guess the common denominator is that, in all of those cases, we see some disproportionality in the frequency with which a lot of those groups interact with youth. I guess my question on this one is like, how would you see training of officers be conducted on this? Like, what are your guys' ideas for the best way for officers to learn about these things, which they probably don't know? You're probably just not like thinking about these things when you join a
Mhm.
police force. So how what's like effective in that way?
This is probably a better question for Lisa than for me, but I will give it a try.
Okay.
I think a lot of it, especially I would say 6, 7, and 8. So race, national origin, LGBTQ, disability, is what the officer thinks they see is not necessarily what's happening. A group of Black youth standing on the street corner in the city are not necessarily there because they've been involved in unlawful activity. A Latino youth is not necessarily involved in a gang, and a LGBTQ youth is not necessarily involved in prostitution. So trying to get at assumptions that people have or that officers may have about youth based on those characteristics, I think that would be a big thing that would be involved in training about those particular populations. And similarly, in some ways with disability, the youth may not be responding to your commands, law enforcement officer, because they're deaf and they can't hear you. They're not being disobedient or insubordinate. If you arrest a youth who is having a mental health crisis, they may react in a way that you perceive as disrespect, as disobedience, as a threat, but that's not necessarily what they are intending. So I think in all of those policies, a lot of it is, here's what you see, here's what you may see, officer, but here's what's really going on. And particularly in the disability area, a lot of, we know that officers can't be experts in everything, in every ill that befalls society or every problem that everyone in society has, even though they often, as the phrase goes, interacts with people on their worst day. So we try in those policies to urge officers to, or urge departments to create relationships with experts in their community. So a youth serving organization, a mental health agency, someone that the officer can call on or partner with in those situations where they're not quite sure what's going on with this kid, and bring somebody else in to help them understand what's going on. And again, I think a big thing with youth is de-escalation, slowing things down, not reacting in the heat of the moment, because they're likely to be reacting in the heat of the moment. And, somebody needs to be the adult in the situation. And often the 13 or 14-year-old just can't. They just can't.
I think, it's like the word that kept coming to mind for me as I was going through them was patience. It's like you can't, it's much more specific than that, the model policies, and they're giving you in these policies concrete, steps and things that should be in place in your police training. But a lot of it to me boiled down to like, you might just need a little more time to get a situation stabilized. And, the presence of a weapon changes a lot of things, but that's not often the case. And so when that's not on the table, these are you have to be the one that's not in the hot thinking mode.
Exactly. I think it was a disability policy or a policy statement from, I think it was the International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Yeah.
And its advice to officers was stop and slow down and ask what's really going on here.
Good advice. So the last box, I just kind of in my own head dubbed the open books policies. So recommending that law enforcement and entities regularly collect and report data around police interaction with youth, and that there be a very open and transparent process for the community to lodge disagreements or complaints about the way that kids have been treated by the police. So I guess on this one, you mentioned calling out different exemplary groups. Is there any system that you guys are aware of, and in the course of your research you kind of came across that does a particularly good job in either of these boxes, that do a really good job with reliable and continuous data, or have a really good complaint process? I know on the data problem, that is a big issue in this country. We just have very bad, top down data on juvenile justice. So
Yes, there's nothing that I would say that comes to mind right away. I know that both of these issues, data collection and transparency, they are often components of Department of Justice and private litigation when there is a settlement reached, because it often is very difficult to just find out, is there a policy for dealing with youth, or is there a policy for use of force generally? Where can I find it? And in my experience, when communities feel like they can't get an answer, they can't even figure out what the rules are, that does not bode well for a relationship of trust between law enforcement and the community. So I think I'm trying to remember. I think that there might be some good data collection in Baltimore Police Department, which is going through implementation of a DOJ consent decree to try to get that word out in the open. When I was at DOJ and I worked on the Meridian matter, the police department agreed to have a complaint form that was available for members of the public if they wanted to make a complaint about that law enforcement agency's interactions with students, and to try to have public meetings to talk about what's going on in the implementation of the decree. So I think some of those issues are things that I would look at and look for.
who would you
I
say?
think we forgot the school one, though, if I could just put in a plug for that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I guess I grouped that into specific groups, but you're right. And I think that yes, you're right. And thanks for calling that out, because I do think especially around how you guys describe the relationship between schools and the school resource officers, having that memorandum of understanding that kind of is explicit about, this is what this person's here to do and here's what they're not here to do, right?
Exactly. It was my bad for not getting it in with 7, 8, and 9, I think. Yes, in the interactions with schools, we definitely wanted to be clear, have law enforcement agencies and schools and school districts clear about what is the role of this officer, whether the officer is, let's say, from the sheriff's department, if they're employed by the sheriff's department, but their duty station is the school. A lot of schools have school-based police departments, whether it's that person, or whether it's a situation where you have neither one of those things, but something happens at school and the school calls in the local police department. So in each one of those situations, we thought that the law enforcement agency and the school should be as clear as possible with each other about what it is these people are here to do. And so when you're picking up the phone and calling the police or summoning the school resource officer or the school police officer, what is it that officer is allowed to get involved in, and what they aren't? And, here again, in our poll, people thought law enforcement officers shouldn't be involved in routine disciplinary proceedings. And this was an area where respondents felt very strongly that law enforcement officers interacting in schools needed policies and training about things like youth mental health, because they are responding to situations that aren't necessarily really a law enforcement matter. There could be a school discipline or a school climate matter. And what should the officer do in that situation? They shouldn't be responding. School personnel shouldn't be calling them, and just making sure that everybody's on the same page about what should and should not be happening in that situation, most strongly that law enforcement officers shouldn't be involved in routine school discipline matters. And there's a lot of advocacy and a lot of data, including from the Department of Justice, very strongly making those similar recommendations.
So you put this out when you guys put this out as like a draft, you got a lot of feedback from people. Now that it's out in the world, what kind of feedback have you been getting? I would imagine that there are some who would look at this and say we need to be much tougher on youth and this is too nice. And then probably on the other side, there's probably people who probably feel like, why even discuss an SRO policy, for example, because we shouldn't have them or we shouldn't be arresting youth at all, right? Like on that level. So what have you heard from those groups and others?
Well, interesting. A lot of the dynamics that you just described came in mostly during the review process.
Oh, okay.
We did have people who said, this is from a law enforcement perspective, this process that you're suggesting in a policy is not realistic, should be stronger. Here are reasons. We really didn't get a lot of soft on crime viewpoint from our law enforcement reviewers. It was more, here's why what you say may not be practical. It may not work. We had somebody who was from a rural area, and that person said, in a small department, this is not going to work, and this is why. So a lot of that feedback was very valuable. We also, in the review process, yes, did get feedback from reviewers who cautioned about not giving a roadmap, which I don't think we did, but not giving a roadmap on like how to arrest youth or talking too much about police in schools, because really what we want is to keep police in schools out. So we did get a lot of that feedback, but it was mostly in the review process, and we very thoughtfully considered the feedback and came out where we did. So some of those people may or may not be happy. Since the policies have come out, though, to my knowledge, the feedback that we have gotten has really been pretty positive. There have been some law enforcement agencies that have reached out to us to talk about how can I implement this in my department. So I think it's not been a huge groundswell of attention. That's one of the reasons that we're happy to have the opportunity to do this. But what we have heard has been, pretty positive. And we're really hoping that law enforcement agencies will take note of these policies and will use them, will try to adopt them or adapt them to their purposes. And because the last thing that we want is for it to be another thing that's out there that then, doesn't get the attention or doesn't get implemented. So we're very interested in having folks reach out to Strategies for Youth to talk about how the policies could be implemented in their jurisdictions.
That was kind of my last question, was where does the act of changing police policy often begin? I mean, is the intended target of these policies a leader in law enforcement, or is it more really like city and county legislators? Like it was hard for me to I'm not inside like that. So what's your sense of like where it begins if you were really trying to incorporate stuff like this?
Well, I think we're trying to hit all of those target audiences. Obviously, I think, law enforcement in this country is very decentralized. And so obviously we want to get the ear and the attention of police chiefs and other police executives who's are training. That would be another audience, a training officer in a law enforcement agency, people who will take this and say, yes, we could use this in our department. We can use this in our community. But also we're trying to reach out to local and state legislators, because increasingly some of these matters are being addressed through state legislation. For example, in the area of youth interrogation, there are now a growing number of states that have laws about law enforcement agents not being able to use deceit in interactions with youth. So there's some audience, we think, at the state level. We think there's an audience, frankly, for insurers, because something goes wrong, police department pays out a large settlement. Maybe if you have a policy and people know about it and you have training, you can avoid those situations. And we also want to reach out to advocates, to people who are representing kids in litigation, in cases, in interactions with law enforcement. Is there a way that you can incorporate these policies into some sort of systemic relief or remedies that you might seek if you're representing a young person whose rights you believe were violated? So we're trying to get every conceivable audience out there to get the word out. And especially through things like being able to participate in this podcast is really great.
A nice, safe answer there, but I'll say that I think you guys, I don't know if it's you get the credit for this or who, but it's really beautifully stated in the policies, kind of what you were just describing, and I'm just going to read from it real quick. Policies serve as a proxy for a contract between law enforcement agencies and communities by clarifying what the agency has directed its officers to do and what the community may expect of its officers. I think that was a really good way of summing up what you're trying to get at here. So the document is called 12 Model Law Enforcement Policies for Youth. We will drop a link to anybody who wants to check that out in our show notes, but you can just go to strategiesforyouth.org. It's right there on the homepage. So Shelley Jackson of Strategies for Youth, thank you so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you, John. I really appreciate the opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thanks to Shelley Jackson of Strategies for Youth for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at safecampaudio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.